The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the grand courthouse as Officer Marcus Williams adjusted his Royal Guard uniform for what he thought would be another routine day. His polished boots echoed through the empty corridors as he made his rounds, checking security before the day's proceedings began. Marcus had served as a Royal Guard for 12 years, protecting judges, officials, and maintaining order in one of the country's most prestigious courts. He took pride in his work, knowing that justice depended on people like him, keeping everything running smoothly. Around 10 in the morning, Marcus heard commotion outside the main entrance. Through the tall windows he could see a small crowd, gathering near the courthouse steps. This wasn't unusual. Protesters, reporters, and curious citizens often assembled outside during high-profile cases. But something about the urgency in people's voices made him pause and look more carefully. A young girl, probably no more than 16, was sitting on the concrete steps. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and even from a distance Marcus could see she was injured. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, and there were visible cuts on her face and hands. She was crying, not the loud, dramatic sobs of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, desperate tears of someone who had been through something terrible. Most people were keeping their distance, unsure of what to do. A few had their phones out, some taking pictures, others calling for help. Marcus immediately radioed for medical assistance and hurried outside. As a Royal Guard, his duty was to protect everyone on courthouse property, and this girl clearly needed help. When Marcus reached her, the girl looked up with frightened eyes. She couldn't have been older than his own daughter. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Please help me," she said. "They hurt me. They said no one would believe me because of who they are." Marcus knelt down beside her, careful not to touch her injured arm. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated before answering. Sarah Chen." She winced as she tried to adjust her position on the hard steps. "Sarah, I'm Officer Williams. You're safe now. Can you tell me who hurt you?" Marcus kept his voice calm and reassuring, the way he'd been trained to speak with trauma victims. Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "It was Judge Harrison's son and his friends. They were at a party last night. When I tried to leave, She couldn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. His jaw tightened as anger rose in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral for Sarah's sake. Judge Richard Harrison was one of the most powerful figures in the courthouse. He had connections throughout the legal system and had been presiding over major cases for over 20 years. His son, Michael Harrison, was known around town as a troublemaker, but his father's influence had always protected him from serious consequences. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and paramedics began treating Sarah's injuries. While they worked, Marcus gathered more details. Sarah explained that she had been at a house party the night before. Michael Harrison and 3 of his college friends had cornered her in a back room. When she tried to resist, they became violent. She managed to escape around midnight but had nowhere to go. She'd spent the night hiding in a park, too scared and ashamed to go home or call the police. "Why did you come here?" Marcus asked. "Why the courthouse?" Sarah looked directly at him. "Because I heard that Judge Harrison was supposed to sentence someone today for assault. I thought maybe if I came here, if people saw what his son did, to me maybe someone would finally listen. Maybe someone would care enough to do something." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He knew exactly which case Sarah was referring to. Judge Harrison was indeed scheduled to sentence a young man from a poor neighborhood who had been convicted of assault. The defendant had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming he had been framed. Now Marcus wondered if there was more to that story than anyone realized. As the paramedics loaded Sarah into the ambulance, she grabbed Marcus's hand. "Please don't let them cover this up," she whispered urgently. "They said their fathers would make sure nothing happened to them. They laughed about it." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I promise you, Sarah, I'll make sure the right people know about this." He meant every word, even though he wasn't entirely sure how he was going to keep that promise. After the ambulance left, Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, his mind racing. He had 2 choices: He could file a standard incident report and let the system handle it through normal channels, knowing that Judge Harrison's influence would likely bury the case, or he could take a more direct approach. Looking at his watch, Marcus realized that Judge Harrison's court session was starting in 30 minutes. The very judge whose son had allegedly attacked Sarah would be presiding over an assault case determining another young person's fate. The irony was bitter and infuriating. Marcus made his decision. He walked back into the courthouse with determined steps, heading straight for Judge Harrison's courtroom. He had evidence of a serious crime, and regardless of who was involved, it was his duty to ensure that justice was served. He thought about Sarah's frightened face and her plea not to let them cover it up. As he approached the courtroom doors, Marcus could hear the familiar sounds of a session beginning. Papers shuffling, people taking their seats, the bailiff calling for order. In a few minutes, he was going to walk through those doors and change everything. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to do what he knew was right, even if it meant challenging one of the most powerful people in the building. The marble corridors that had seemed so familiar and routine just hours earlier now felt charged with tension and possibility. Marcus Williams, Royal Guard, was about to become something more. He was about to become the catalyst for justice that Sarah Chen desperately needed. Marcus stood outside courtroom 3A, listening to Judge Harrison's voice boom through the heavy wooden doors. The familiar routine of court proceedings continued inside, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Marcus checked his radio one more time, making sure it was working properly. What he was about to do would require backup, and he needed to be prepared for any situation. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed open the courtroom doors. The heavy wood creaked slightly as he entered, causing a few heads to turn. Judge Harrison looked up from his bench with mild annoyance. Interruptions during proceedings were highly irregular. "Officer Williams," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to complete control over his courtroom. "This session is in progress. Unless there's an emergency, please wait until we recess." Marcus walked steadily down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet courtroom. Everyone was watching now: the defendant, lawyers, court, reporter, and the handful of observers in the gallery. "Your Honor, this is an emergency that requires immediate attention." Judge Harrison's expression darkened. At 62 years old, he was not a man who appreciated being challenged, especially not in front of a room full of people. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his black robes immaculate, and his reputation for maintaining strict order in his courtroom was legendary. "Officer Williams, I'm warning you. Whatever this is about can wait until—" "It's about your son, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Michael Harrison and 3 of his friends. They're wanted for questioning in connection with a serious assault that occurred last night." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison's face went through several changes: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like fear. The defense attorney looked up sharply from his papers, suddenly very interested in this unexpected development. The defendant, a young Hispanic man named Carlos Rodriguez, leaned forward in his chair. That's impossible," Judge Harrison stammered, his usual commanding presence wavering. "My son was home last night. I saw him myself." Marcus remained, calm and professional. "Your Honor, I have a victim who was brought to this courthouse this morning with serious injuries. She has identified your son and 3 accomplices by name. She provided detailed information about the location and circumstances of the attack." Judge Harrison's face was growing pale. "Officer Williams, I think you're mistaken. Perhaps the victim was confused, traumatized. These things happen." "The victim wasn't confused, Your Honor. She knew exactly who attacked her. She came here specifically because she knew you were presiding over this assault case today. She wanted someone to know the truth." Carlos Rodriguez's defense attorney, Maria Santos, suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, my client has maintained his innocence throughout this entire trial. He's claimed repeatedly that he was framed for the assault he's being sentenced for today. If there's evidence that suggests a pattern of behavior involving your family, "Sit down," Judge Harrison snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. The commanding authority he was known for was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Marcus continued, his training keeping him focused despite the tension in the room. "Your Honor, the victim also mentioned that the perpetrators discussed using family connections to avoid consequences. She said they laughed about how their fathers would protect them from any legal trouble." The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. Everyone present was witnessing the unraveling of one of the most powerful figures in the local justice system. "Your Honor," Defense Attorney Santos pressed forward, sensing an opportunity. "I move for an immediate recess so that these allegations can be properly investigated. If there's any possibility that my client is being sentenced for crimes actually committed by someone else." "Motion denied," Judge Harrison shouted, but his hands were shaking visibly now. "This is clearly a desperate attempt to disrupt legitimate proceedings with unfounded accusations." Marcus stepped closer to the bench. "Your Honor, I have physical evidence. The victim's injuries are consistent with her account. Medical personnel have documented everything. Additionally, there were witnesses at the party who can corroborate her story." Judge Harrison's breathing was becoming labored. The weight of the situation was clearly affecting him. This is obviously a mistake. My son would never. He's never been in serious trouble before." "That's not entirely accurate, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "While researching this incident, I discovered several sealed juvenile records and complaints that were mysteriously dropped over the years. It appears there have been previous allegations that were handled quietly." The prosecutor, David Kim, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, given the serious nature of these allegations and their potential connection to the case currently before this court, I believe we need to suspend proceedings immediately." Judge Harrison looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for an escape route. His perfect reputation was crumbling in real time, in front of lawyers, court staff, and members of the public. Everything he had built over decades was falling apart because of his son's actions. "Officer Williams," Judge Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you absolutely certain about these allegations?" Marcus nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. The investigation is ongoing, but the evidence is substantial. The victim is currently receiving medical treatment for her injuries, and she's prepared to file formal charges." Judge Harrison closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, he looked older and more defeated than anyone had ever seen him. "What exactly are you asking me to do, officer?" "Your Honor, I believe this court needs to know that there may have been a miscarriage of justice in the Rodriguez case. If Mr. Rodriguez was wrongfully convicted for crimes actually committed by your son and his friends, then we have an obligation to address that immediately." Carlos Rodriguez was staring at Marcus with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For months, he had been telling anyone who would listen that he was innocent, that he had been set up. Now, finally, someone was paying attention. Judge Harrison looked at his hands for a long moment, then at Carlos Rodriguez, then back at Marcus. The courtroom remained completely silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "Officer Williams," Judge Harrison said slowly, "I need you to explain exactly what evidence you have, and I need you to do it clearly and completely. This court deserves to know the truth, regardless of the personal consequences." Marcus realized that despite everything, Judge Harrison was still capable of doing the right thing. Even as his world collapsed around him, he was choosing justice over self-preservation. It was going to be a long day, but for the first time since Sarah Chen had grabbed his hand on the courthouse steps, Marcus felt like real justice might actually be possible. Marcus pulled out his notebook and began presenting the evidence systematically. The courtroom remained silent as he detailed Sarah Chen's account, the medical documentation of her injuries, and the initial witness statements he had gathered from other party attendees. "Your Honor, the victim stated that the attack occurred at 1247 Maple Street, which is the residence of Thomas Patterson. Mr. Patterson is a friend of your son and was hosting the party. When I contacted the hospital, they confirmed treating Miss Chen for a dislocated shoulder facial lacerations, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Judge Harrison's face grew paler with each detail. Carlos Rodriguez's attorney was taking notes furiously, while the prosecutor looked increasingly uncomfortable. Everyone in the courtroom could sense that they were witnessing something historic. The complete dismantling of a powerful family's carefully constructed facade. The victim also provided specific details about the attackers. Marcus continued. She identified Michael Harrison, Thomas Patterson, James Whitfield, and Robert Chen. No relation to her despite sharing the same last name. All four are college students, all from prominent local families. At the mention of these names, several people in the courtroom exchanged glances. These weren't random troublemakers. These were young men from the most influential families in the community. James Whitfield's father was the district attorney. Robert Chen's family owned the largest law firm in the city. Defense attorney Santos stood up again. Your Honor, I feel compelled to point out that James Whitfield is the son of District Attorney Whitfield, who personally prosecuted my client. If there's evidence suggesting that the DA's son was involved in the very crimes my client was convicted of, the implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about one wrongful conviction anymore. This was about systemic corruption, about powerful families protecting their children while innocent people went to prison. Judge Harrison rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with the magnitude of what was unfolding. Officer Williams, you said there were witnesses at this party. Have you spoken with any of them? Yes, Your Honor. I contacted 3 individuals who were present. Initially, they were reluctant to speak, but when I explained the seriousness of the situation, 2 of them agreed to provide statements. Marcus flipped through his notebook. Jessica Morrison, age 19, stated that she saw 4 male students corner Sarah Chen in a back bedroom around 11:30 p.m. She said she heard shouting and what sounded like a struggle, but she was afraid to intervene because she recognized who was involved. And the second witness? David Park, age 20, confirmed seeing Sarah Chen leave the house around midnight in obvious distress. He said her clothes were torn and she was crying. He also stated that Michael Harrison and his friends were laughing and making crude comments about what had just happened. Judge Harrison closed his eyes again as if he could make this all disappear, but when he opened them, Marcus was still standing there with his evidence and Carlos Rodriguez was still sitting at the defendant's table, waiting to learn his fate. Your Honor, Defense Attorney Santos pressed, my client has an alibi for the time of the original assault. He was working a night shift at Martinez Restaurant. We provided time cards and witness testimony, but somehow that evidence was deemed insufficient. Now we're learning that the real perpetrators may be the sons of some of the most powerful people in our justice system. Prosecutor Kim finally spoke up, his voice tight with tension. Your Honor, these are very serious allegations being made, without proper investigation. We can't simply accept the word of one victim and a couple of party attendees to overturn a conviction that went through proper legal channels. Marcus turned to face the prosecutor. Mr. Kim, with respect, are you suggesting that we ignore credible evidence of innocence? The victim's injuries are real. The witness statements are consistent. And there are disturbing patterns in how certain cases involving these families have been handled in the past. What patterns? Judge Harrison asked, though he seemed to dread the answer. Your Honor, over the past 3 years there have been 8 complaints filed against these 4 young men, charges ranging from assault to sexual misconduct to vandalism. In every single case, the charges were either dropped due to insufficient evidence or the complainants withdrew their statements. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. 8 previous complaints that had all mysteriously disappeared. The scope of the cover-up was becoming clear to everyone present. Defense Attorney Santos was practically vibrating with excitement. Your Honor, this suggests a pattern of obstruction of justice. If my client was framed to protect these individuals, then we're looking at conspiracy charges at the highest levels of our legal system. Judge Harrison looked around his courtroom, the domain where he had wielded absolute authority for 2 decades. Now that authority was crumbling, and he was faced with a choice that would define not just his career, but his legacy and his conscience. "Officer Williams," he said quietly, "what exactly are you requesting from this court?" Marcus straightened his shoulders. "Your Honor, I'm requesting that you order the immediate arrest of Michael Harrison, Thomas Patterson, James Whitfield, and Robert Chen on charges of assault and sexual assault. I'm also requesting that the conviction of Carlos Rodriguez be suspended, pending a full investigation into whether he was wrongfully convicted." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the courtroom understood that they were at a pivotal moment. Judge Harrison held not just his son's fate in his hands, but the integrity of the entire local justice system. Carlos Rodriguez spoke for the first time, his voice barely audible. "Your Honor, I've been telling the truth for 8 months. I never hurt anyone. I was working, just trying to support my family. Please just look at the evidence, that's all I've ever asked for." Judge Harrison stared at Carlos for a long moment, then looked at Marcus, then at the lawyers, and finally at his own hands resting on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silent courtroom, everyone heard every word. "Officer Williams, I want you to issue arrest warrants for all 4 individuals you mentioned. I want them brought before this court immediately." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I'm also ordering an immediate suspension of Mr. Rodriguez's conviction pending a full investigation by an independent prosecutor from outside this jurisdiction." The courtroom exploded into noise, gasps, exclamations, and the sound of reporters frantically typing on their phones. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, but for once, he didn't seem to mind the chaos. He had just made the hardest decision of his career, choosing justice over family loyalty. Marcus felt a surge of relief and pride. Sarah Chen's courage in coming forward was about to change everything, not just for Carlos Rodriguez, but potentially for many other victims who had been silenced by power and corruption. But as he prepared to leave the courtroom to execute the arrest warrants, Marcus knew that the real fight was just beginning. Going after the sons of the district attorney, a prominent judge, and the city's most powerful law firm was going to make him a lot of enemies. However, as he thought about Sarah's frightened face and Carlos's desperate plea for justice, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. Within an hour of leaving Judge Harrison's courtroom, Marcus found himself at the center of a legal and political storm, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Word of the arrest warrants had spread quickly through the courthouse, and the phones were ringing constantly. District Attorney Whitfield had rushed over personally, demanding to speak with Judge Harrison immediately. Marcus coordinated with other officers to execute the warrants. The first arrest was Thomas Patterson, found at his family's mansion trying to pack a suitcase. His parents stood in their marble foyer, threatening lawsuits and demanding to know how dare the police enter their home. Thomas himself seemed shocked that there were actually consequences for his actions. "This is insane," Thomas kept repeating as Marcus read him his rights. "My dad will have your job for this. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my family is?" Marcus remained professional, but inside he felt satisfaction at finally seeing one of these privileged young men face real accountability. "Mr. Patterson, you're being arrested for assault and sexual assault. You have the right to remain silent." The second arrest was more challenging. Robert Chen was at his family's law firm, surrounded by a team of high-powered attorneys who immediately began challenging every aspect of the warrant. The firm's lobby was filled with expensive artwork and leather furniture, a monument to the family's wealth and influence. Robert's father, senior partner William Chen, was furious. "Officer Williams, this is harassment. My son was home studying last night. We have witnesses who can confirm his whereabouts. Sir, your son has been identified by the victim and multiple witnesses. He needs to come with us now." Marcus gestured to the backup officers he had brought, making it clear that resistance would be futile. As Robert was led away in handcuffs, his father shouted threats about lawsuits and career destruction. But Marcus had heard it all before, and he knew that rich families always made the same threats when their children finally faced consequences. The third arrest was where things got really complicated. James Whitfield, son of the district attorney, was at the DA's office when Marcus arrived with the warrant. The building was buzzing with activity as news of the other arrests spread throughout the legal community. District Attorney Richard Whitfield met Marcus in the lobby, his face red with rage. "Officer Williams, this is absolutely unacceptable. You will not arrest my son based on the wild accusations of some troubled girl. I'm ordering you to stand down immediately." Marcus held up the arrest warrant. "Sir, this warrant was issued by Judge Harrison. I have no choice but to execute it. Your son needs to come with me." Judge Harrison is compromised. His judgment is clearly affected by his own son's involvement. This entire situation is a setup designed to embarrass prominent families in this community. "Mr. Whitfield, are you interfering with a lawful arrest?" Marcus asked calmly, aware that other officers and courthouse personnel were watching this confrontation carefully. The DA's face grew even redder. "I'm protecting my son from a corrupt investigation based on fabricated evidence. James was home with us last night. He's never been in any kind of trouble." "Sir, we have evidence suggesting otherwise. Multiple witnesses have placed your son at the scene of the crime. If you continue to interfere, I'll have to place you under arrest as well." The threat hung in the air for a moment. Everyone present understood that Marcus was prepared to arrest the district attorney himself if necessary. It was an unprecedented situation that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. District Attorney Whitfield finally stepped aside, but his eyes burned with hatred as he watched his son being led away in handcuffs. "This isn't over, Williams. I'll make sure you never work in law enforcement again." The fourth and most difficult arrest was Michael Harrison. Judge Harrison had recused himself from all involvement, but he had given Marcus his home address. The Harrison family lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, complete with gates and security cameras. When Marcus rang the doorbell, it was answered by Mrs. Catherine Harrison, an elegant woman in her 50s who clearly hadn't heard about the day's events yet. "Officer Williams, what brings you here? Is there some kind of security concern at the courthouse?" "Ma'am, I have a warrant for the arrest of your son, Michael. Is he home?" The color drained from her face. "Arrest? There must be some mistake. Michael is a good boy. He's never been in serious trouble." Marcus showed her the warrant. "Ma'am, your son has been identified as one of 4 suspects in a serious assault that occurred last night. I need to take him into custody." Mrs. Harrison began crying softly as she called for her son. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, and Marcus could see immediately that he knew why the police were there. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Michael Harrison, you're under arrest for assault and sexual assault," Marcus announced, producing his handcuffs. Wait, Michael stammered. "I can explain. It wasn't like that. The girl wanted it. She was flirting with all of us all night." Marcus felt his jaw clench at the casual way Michael dismissed Sarah's trauma, but he kept his voice professional. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court." As Marcus led Michael to the police car, Mrs. Harrison followed, pleading with him to be gentle with her son. "Please, Officer Williams, he's just a boy. He made a mistake. Surely this can be worked out quietly between families." "Ma'am, sexual assault isn't a mistake that gets worked out quietly. Your son and his friends seriously injured a young woman. She deserves justice regardless of who his father is." By evening, all 4 suspects were in custody, and the local news had picked up the story. The headlines were explosive. "Judge's son arrested in sexual assault case," and "DA's son among 4 wealthy students charged." The story was spreading beyond the local community, attracting attention from state and national news outlets. Marcus sat in his supervisor's office, writing his report. Captain Rodriguez, no relation to Carlos, was reviewing the day's events with a mixture of pride and concern. "Williams, you realize you've just declared war on some of the most powerful families in the state?" "Captain, I just did my job. A victim came forward with credible evidence of a serious crime. We had witness statements and medical documentation. What choice did I have?" "You could have passed it up the chain. Let someone else make the hard decisions." Marcus shook his head. "Sarah Chen looked me in the eye and asked me not to let them cover it up. I gave her my word. Besides, Carlos Rodriguez has been sitting in jail for 8 months for crimes he didn't commit." How many other innocent people are behind bars while the real criminals walk free? Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. You're right, of course, but this is going to get ugly fast. These families have connections everywhere. Judges, politicians, media owners. They're going to come after you with everything they have. Let them come, Marcus replied. The evidence speaks for itself, and now that this is public, it's going to be a lot harder for them to make it disappear. As Marcus drove home that night, he thought about Sarah Chen recovering in the hospital and Carlos Rodriguez finally having hope for real justice. The powerful families would indeed fight back, and the next few months would be difficult. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt like the justice system was actually working the way it was supposed to. Sometimes, doing the right thing required someone to stand up and refuse to be intimidated by wealth and power. The next morning brought chaos that Marcus had never experienced in his 12 years of service. When he arrived at the courthouse, reporters were camped outside, news vans lined the street, and his supervisor informed him that he was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his conduct. An investigation into my conduct? Marcus asked Captain Rodriguez incredulously. What exactly am I being investigated for? Procedural violations, exceeding your authority, compromising an ongoing court proceeding. The complaint started rolling. In at 6 this morning, Captain Rodriguez replied, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. It's coming from high up, Marcus. Higher than me, higher than the chief, state level. Marcus understood immediately. The powerful families he had crossed weren't wasting time. They were using every connection and calling in every favor to destroy his career and credibility before the case could proceed. Despite being on administrative leave, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Chen and Carlos Rodriguez. He decided to visit Sarah at the hospital, hoping to check on her recovery and prepare her for what was coming. He found Sarah in a private room, her arm in a sling, and her face still showing bruises from the attack. When she saw him, her eyes filled with relief. Officer Williams, I was so worried. The lawyers have been calling all morning saying terrible things about you, trying to convince me to drop the charges. What kind of things? Marcus asked, pulling up a chair beside her. Bed. They said you were a corrupt cop trying to get famous by attacking innocent young men. They said I was confused about what happened, that maybe I had too much to drink and don't remember clearly. They offered my family money to make this all go away. Marcus felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. Sarah, I want you to know that you did absolutely nothing wrong. What happened to you was a crime, and those men need to face consequences. But I also need you to understand that this is going to get much worse before it gets better. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, but I can't let them do this to other girls. When I was lying in that park last night bleeding and scared, I thought about just disappearing, maybe moving away, never telling anyone. But then I thought about other parties, other girls who might not be strong enough to fight back. Her courage amazed Marcus. Despite everything she had been through, despite the pressure and threats from powerful lawyers, she was still determined to seek justice. There's something else you need to know, Sarah continued. A woman came to see me yesterday evening, after you left. She said her name was Linda Morrison. She told me that her daughter Jennifer was assaulted by the same group of boys 2 years ago. Marcus leaned forward, immediately interested. What happened to Jennifer's case? It never went to trial. According to her mother, Jennifer reported the assault to police, but the investigation was mysteriously dropped after a few weeks. Jennifer became so depressed and frightened that she had to drop out of college and move to another state. This was exactly what Marcus had suspected, a pattern of attacks followed by cover-ups. Did Mrs. Morrison say anything else? She gave me this, Sarah said, handing Marcus a business card. It's for a lawyer who specializes in cases against powerful defendants. She said this lawyer had tried to help Jennifer, but couldn't get anywhere because all the evidence mysteriously disappeared. Marcus looked at the card. Elizabeth Warren, attorney at law, specializing in civil rights and criminal defense. The address was in the state capital, about 2 hours away. That afternoon, despite his administrative leave, Marcus drove to meet with Elizabeth Warren. Her office was modest compared to the luxury law firm where Robert Chen's family worked, but it was filled with awards for civil rights work and victim advocacy. Elizabeth Warren was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through people's pretenses. "Officer Williams, I've been following your case in the news. It takes real courage to go after families like these." "Ms. Warren, I think there's a pattern here that goes beyond just this one incident. I believe these young men have been attacking women for years and their families have been covering it up." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "I've been tracking these families for 3 years now. Jennifer Morrison was just one of several young women who came to me with similar stories. Every time we try to build a case, evidence disappears, witnesses change their stories, and investigating officers get reassigned or fired." She pulled out a thick file folder. "Michael Harrison, Thomas Patterson, James Whitfield, and Robert Chen. I have records of at least 6 separate incidents involving various combinations of these 4 young men. Sexual assaults, violent assaults, harassment, stalking. In every case, charges were dropped or never filed." Marcus felt sick as he looked through the files. Photo after photo of young women who looked like Sarah, bruised, frightened, seeking justice that never came. "Why hasn't this information come out before?" he asked. "Because these families own half the judges and prosecutors in the state. They have connections in law enforcement, media, and politics. Anyone who tries to challenge them finds their career destroyed." Elizabeth paused, studying Marcus carefully. "Like what's happening to you right now. So what can we do?" Elizabeth smiled for the first time since Marcus had arrived. "Well, for the first time, we have a victim who's willing to fight back publicly. Physical evidence that can't be disappeared.
And multiple witnesses. Most importantly, we have an honest cop who was willing to do the right thing regardless of the consequences." She pulled out another folder. "I've been working with federal prosecutors who are interested in civil rights
violations and conspiracy cases. If we can prove that local authorities have been systematically covering up crimes based on the defendant's family connections, this becomes a federal case." Marcus felt a surge of hope. "You mean the FBI could get involved?" "Already happening," Elizabeth replied. "I made some calls this morning. Federal agents are reviewing all the previous cases involving these 4 defendants. They're also investigating whether local prosecutors and judges have been taking bribes or other inducements to make cases disappear." The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clear. This wasn't just about 4 college students who assaulted Sarah Chen. This was about a systematic corruption that had allowed wealthy families to buy their children's way out of serious crimes for years. "There's something else," Elizabeth continued. "Carlos Rodriguez isn't the only person who may have been wrongfully convicted to protect these boys. I've identified at least 3 other cases where young men from poor backgrounds were convicted of crimes that fit the pattern of attacks by our 4 suspects." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the corruption they were uncovering. How is this possible? How did they get away with it for so long? Money, connections, and a system that protects its own, Elizabeth replied bitterly. Judge Harrison, to his credit, chose justice over family loyalty yesterday, but he's one of the few honest judges left in this jurisdiction. Most of the others owe their positions to political support from these same families. She showed Marcus a chart she had created, mapping out the connections between the families, local politicians, judges, and prosecutors. It looked like a spider web of corruption that touched every level of the local justice system. "The federal investigation is going to take months to complete," Elizabeth warned. "In the meantime, these families are going to use every dirty trick they know to discredit you, intimidate Sarah, and make this case disappear. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus thought about Sarah's courage, about Carlos Rodriguez sitting in jail for crimes he didn't commit, about all the other victims who had been silenced. "I'm prepared to see this through no matter what it takes." Elizabeth smiled again. "Good. Because tomorrow we're going to file a federal civil rights lawsuit against all 4 defendants and their families. We're also going to request a federal investigation into civil rights violations by local law enforcement and judicial officials." As Marcus drove back home, he felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time since this all started, he felt like they had a real chance of winning. That evening, his phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, lawyers threatening lawsuits, and anonymous callers making threats against him and his family. Marcus turned off his phone and sat with his wife and daughter explaining what was happening and why he had made the choices he had. "Dad," his 16-year-old daughter Emma said, "the girl who was hurt, she's the same age as me, isn't she?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, she is." "Then you did the right thing," Emma said simply. "Someone needs to protect girls like us from boys who think they can do whatever they want because their families have money." Looking at his daughter, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. No matter what happened to his career, no matter what threats the powerful families made, he would continue fighting for justice. Sarah Chen deserved it, Carlos Rodriguez deserved it, and every future victim deserved it. The war was just beginning, but Marcus Williams was ready to fight. 6 months later, Marcus Williams stood in a federal courthouse watching as the final verdicts were read in what had become known as the Golden Boys case. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and members of the community who had followed the case from the beginning. The federal investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that shocked even veteran prosecutors. FBI agents had discovered evidence of bribery, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice that went back over a decade. The 4 young men, Michael Harrison, Thomas Patterson, James Whitfield, and Robert Chen, were just the tip of an iceberg that included corrupt judges, prosecutors, and police officials. On the charge of sexual assault in the first degree, we find the defendant, Michael Harrison, guilty, the jury foreman announced. The same verdict followed for each of the other 3 defendants. Additionally, all 4 were found guilty of conspiracy and civil rights violations. Marcus looked across the courtroom at Sarah Chen, who was sitting with her family, and Elizabeth Warren. She had endured months of character assassination, death, threats, and attempts to buy her silence, but she had never wavered in her commitment to see justice done. Her courage had inspired other victims to come forward, ultimately leading to charges in 8 separate assault cases. The sentences were substantial. Each of the 4 defendants received 12-15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 8 years. Judge Patricia Miller, the federal judge overseeing the case, made it clear that wealth and family connections would not protect them from the consequences of their crimes. But the young men were not the only ones facing justice. District Attorney Richard Whitfield had been arrested 3 months earlier on charges of obstruction of justice and accepting bribes. The evidence showed that he had deliberately prosecuted innocent men to cover up his son's crimes, accepting payments and political favors from the other wealthy families in return. 2 other local judges had also been arrested, along with several police officials who had been paid to make evidence disappear and investigations stall. The corruption had been so extensive that the federal government had taken over prosecution of all pending cases in the jurisdiction. Carlos Rodriguez had been released from prison 4 months earlier, with all charges dropped and a formal apology from the state. He was now working with a team of lawyers to seek compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. 3 other men had also been exonerated in connection with crimes actually committed by the Golden Boys. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marcus had said when they met after his release, "I'm sorry it took so long for the truth to come out." Carlos had shaken his hand firmly. "Officer Williams, you saved my life. If you hadn't listened to that girl, if you hadn't had the courage to stand up to those powerful people, I would still be in prison. My family will never forget what you did." Marcus had been fully reinstated to his position, with a commendation for exceptional service and courage. The investigation had cleared him of all wrongdoing and revealed that the complaints against him had been fabricated by corrupt officials trying to protect the conspiracy. But the real victory was seeing Sarah Chen testify at the trial. She had transformed from a frightened, injured teenager into a confident young woman who spoke clearly and powerfully about her experience. Her testimony had been devastating to the defense's attempts to portray the assault as a misunderstanding. They thought they could hurt me and get away with it because of who their families were, Sarah had told the jury. They laughed about how their fathers would protect them. But they were wrong. Officer Williams showed me that there are still people in the system who care more about justice than politics or money. The civil lawsuit filed by Elizabeth Warren had also been successful. The families had been ordered to pay millions in damages to the victims, money that would help fund counseling, education, and support services for survivors of sexual assault. Judge Harrison had retired from the bench, unable to continue after his son's conviction. In a private conversation with Marcus, he had expressed gratitude for the officer's courage in exposing the truth. "You could have looked the other way," Judge Harrison had said. "You could have filed a report and let someone else handle it. Instead, you chose to do what was right, even though you knew it would cost you. That takes a special kind of courage." As Marcus left the federal courthouse after the sentencing, he was approached by a young woman he didn't recognize. She appeared, nervous but determined. "Officer Williams," she said, "my name is Maria Santos. I was assaulted by those same boys 3 years ago, but I was too scared to report it. Watching Sarah Chen's courage gave me the strength to finally come forward. I just wanted to thank you for listening to her, for believing her, for fighting, for all of us." Similar conversations had happened dozens of times over the past months. Women who had been silenced by fear, shame, or threats had found their voices again. The case had become a symbol of hope for victims everywhere, proof that even the most powerful people could be held accountable for their crimes. Marcus drove home that evening thinking about how dramatically his life had changed since that morning, when he found Sarah Chen crying on the courthouse steps. He had just been doing his job, but sometimes doing your job means standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. His daughter Emma had been following the case closely, writing about it for her school newspaper. "Dad," she had said recently, "I used to think that rich people always got away with everything. But you proved that's not true. You proved that one person who refuses to give up can make a difference." As Marcus pulled into his driveway, he saw his wife and daughter waiting for him on the front porch. The case was over, justice had been served, and life could return to normal. But Marcus knew he would never forget the lesson he had learned, that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right, despite your fear. Sarah Chen had shown that courage when she came forward, despite knowing how powerful her attackers were. Carlos Rodriguez had shown it by maintaining his innocence even when everyone told him to accept a plea deal. And Marcus had learned that sometimes being a royal guard means protecting not just buildings and judges, but the very idea of justice itself. The Golden Boys were finally behind bars, their families' corruption exposed, and innocent people had been freed. Most importantly, future victims would know that there were people in the system willing to fight for them, regardless of how much money or power their attackers possessed. Justice, Marcus reflected as he joined his family on the porch, wasn't just about laws and courts and procedures. It was about ordinary people having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible, and sometimes that courage can change everything.